Welcome, everybody. My name is J.B. Woods, and I'm the owner of Greenpoint Insurance Advisors here in Colorado. And today we have a very special webinar. It's basically a prelude to our workshop that we're going to be conducting at the Cannabis Business Summit on June 20th, 2016 in Oakland, Colorado. And today I have some great guests who are going to be part of the workshop with me. I have Bob Hoban from Hoban and Fiola. Say hi, Bob.
Good day, everybody.
And I also have Karen Lazarus. She's the owner of Sweet Mary Jane, based here in Boulder, Colorado. Say hello, Karen.
Hey there.
All right. So what I'd like to do today is go over briefly the workshop that we're planning on holding at the Cannabis Business Summit in Oakland. It's entitled Starting and Operating a Successful Medical Cannabis Dispensary, Cultivation, and Infused Products Company. And the way that we designed the workshop is it's really designed for folks who are looking at entering the cannabis industry or even existing operators who own various types of licenses who want to maybe look at improving their operation or learning different ways to operate in this regulated environment. So I think some of the goals, in particular with the workshop, is to, number one, gain valuable information and insight. When you look at the team that we've assembled for the workshop, all of us have been in this industry since either 2008 and 2009. So we all have 6 or 7 years of experience. And quite frankly, when you're in the cannabis industry, each year is probably equivalent to about 10 years of your life, quite frankly. So the good news is if you attend the workshop, you're going to get great information and insight. We also wanted to make the workshop highly interactive with breakouts and case studies. As you can see on this screen right here, we actually did last year a mini version of this, and we did the breakouts, and a lot of the feedback that we had gotten was it was so valuable for the participants to be able to interact with each other and discuss the concepts that we had taught them and then actually apply them in real life. So interaction is important. We want to make it fun, learn best practices. Of course, when you operate a cannabis-related company, growing revenue is important. Also avoiding mistakes and protecting your reputation, especially right now in the environment that we're in. There's a lot changing here in Colorado, which stems to other parts of the country as well. As I mentioned, it's an excellent networking opportunity. Space is limited, so if you're contemplating coming to our full-day workshop, it's really best to reserve your tickets now. So what we're going to do is for the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the individual challenges that we've all experienced. And I'm going to start with Karen because she's not only a successful infused products manufacturer here in Boulder, but she's also a best-selling author. And so it's an absolute privilege to be able to have her on this panel. She's been doing this since 2009, and one of the things that she says in her bio is that her passion for cooking using the healing properties of cannabis has been an exciting adventure, and I feel very lucky to have been able to channel what I love into a career. So if I may, Karen, I'd like to ask you, over the last 6 years that you've been operating your company, what are some of the challenges that you've experienced that you'd like to share?
Oh gosh, JB, there have been so many of them. At the beginning, it was, of course, trying to understand dosing before we even had labs out there to test with. People just telling us, you use this much and that's what your dose will be. And then finally getting into the part of the industry where labs were coming on board and we could test, and that's now become another challenge for us because every lab gives us a different result. So that's been a big problem for us. So laboratory testing has been, that's been a very, very big issue. Other problems, couriers. We have used courier services for years and then have found out that They are not allowed to store products in warehouses because they're not licensed. We had an issue with the courier service losing 10 pounds of product.
Wow.
Yeah, they
Wow.
went and picked it up and said they told us they lost it.
Wow.
They were, consequently, of course, shut down by the Med.
And Karen, when this happened, was this something that happened early on in your business?
This particular incident happened about 6 months ago.
Okay, wow.
But before that, courier services were popping up all over the place.
Right.
Courier services can't store product.
Okay.
They're not licensed.
Okay.
So how are they getting from here to Durango and back?
Right.
Without having warehouses. So I think that's now something that's getting on board with the Met, and we're going to be able to see courier services with licenses.
Right. Right.
Other issues, labeling, that changes all the time. Right now we are required to put on every single edible that goes out the door the nutrients used in the grow to produce the cannabis that we are then using to bake with. So that side label that's on there listing all the nutrients is confusing to the patient because they see this list of odd products, pesticides that are allowed, and other ingredients like bone meal worm or whatever, and they call us up and they say, are you putting that in a cookie?
Right.
Of course we're not.
So if I was to compare that, Karen, to, let's say, a normal food product, such as like growing corn, right? And that corn was then used in another baked good, and then having a label that shows all the different chemicals or pesticides that were being used in corn, that doesn't happen with corn, correct?
That doesn't happen with anything.
Right. So one of the challenges that you're saying is that you've got this label, you've got patients questioning the reason behind having all of these ingredients on this label when it's a food product.
It's a food product, and when we first were required to put this label on, I called some of these companies that are making the pesticides to ask. I said, is this in the cannabis that we're using?
Right.
And they said, almost definitely not. By the time that cannabis is harvested, on the particular pesticides I was calling that, I'm not saying that about everyone.
Yes.
But the ones that I called about, they said, no, by the time that plant is grown and, it's all fleshed out, it's clean.
Yes.
So those products are not even in there anymore.
Yes.
But we're still putting them on as,
yes.
A label on it, on a cookie.
Yes, yes. And so I would say probably, Karen, obviously one of the challenges as a business owner in the medical cannabis industry is just probably keeping up with compliance, right? Because when you talk about labeling, this is about compliance, it's regulatory compliance, right? How do you manage to do all of that?
Well, really what I do is I check these rules at least 2 or 3 times a week.
Gotcha. Okay.
I'm just on there all the time, and a lot of the times I'm not sure of what I've read.
Okay.
It's a little confusing.
It's complicated.
It is.
It's very complicated.
So
right?
I pass it on to a couple of other people at the kitchen and say, this is what I'm understanding. Do you see it this way as well?
Great idea.
And then I call them in.
Right.
And say, do I have this right?
Got it. And probably, would you say, even worst case scenario, if there's regulatory language that is just so complicated, then probably that's where somebody like Bob and his firm would come in.
Absolutely.
Right.
We seem to be talking about all the time now.
Right.
Yeah.
Better for worse. Got it.
Yeah, no,
But that's really important information for people out there listening, is that you've got to use your resources in this business, because as a business owner, not only are you managing your company and the great products that you offer to your patients and your customers, but there's also a regulatory side, a legal side that you've got to be up on in this business. And using those resources, such as Bob, becomes very important.
Absolutely. You need somebody who can interpret a lot of these rules for you, because even though these rules have come out of the Marijuana Enforcement Division,
yes,
sometimes it's hard to get an answer from them.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Anything else that you want to share?
I think that our latest challenge, and it's not in place right now, but it's going to be something we're going to have to start putting on the products October of 2016, is the THC stamp.
Got it.
So that is going to be a big challenge for a lot of people in this industry to have to stamp the actual edible.
And so, Karen, when you say THC stamp, for people out there that are listening, what does a THC stamp mean?
The Marijuana Enforcement Division has given us an image of what this stamp has to look like. It's for the edible. It's a black and white. It's diamond shaped. The diamond is black. In the center, it says THC.
Mm-hmm.
Above THC, there's an exclamation point.
Got it.
So black and white on your edible, and that same exact stamp in red on your package. On your package, half inch. On your edible, quarter inch.
Got it.
So that's going to be a big challenge for a lot of us.
Okay. And so not only it's a challenge because financially it costs more money to do some of these things, correct?
It costs more money, and we have to make sure that it says the THC clearly enough so that when you pick it up, you notice right away that it says THC. It can't be rubbed off.
Right.
So it's got to be on there.
Got it. So there's a saying. The saying is the devil's in the details, right? So if you're in the cannabis industry, the devil is certainly in the details.
Yeah, and you can get through it. There's a lot of hoops to jump through.
Well, I think Karen and I were both talking earlier, even despite the challenges that we all face in the cannabis sector, we wouldn't trade this experience for anything.
No.
We thoroughly enjoy it.
I love it, and I feel very blessed to be a part of it.
Terrific. And I think that's what's so important about if you end up attending the workshop. It's not only about addressing these issues, but also how to solve these issues and ways to do that. Alrighty?
Yeah, and we may have a little secret to solve that THC stamp. So
stay tuned.
Yeah.
Stay tuned. Well, Karen, thank you so much. The next person is Bob Hoban. He's a named partner at Hoban and Viola. Bob is recognized as one of the leading commercial cannabis practitioners nationwide, representing private and publicly held clients in numerous states and abroad. He's really one of the original cannabis business-related law firms since 2008. Bob is an AV preeminent rated attorney and seasoned full-service commercial practitioner, serving both THC and CBD business models. And one of the things I'd like to point out, Bob is also a professor at the University of Denver in their Law and Society program. So it's an absolute honor to have Bob here as well. And so, Bob, if you don't mind, help us understand what you've experienced over the last 6 or 7 years with perhaps some of your clients in this growing industry.
Yeah, thanks, JB. It's a pleasure to be here, and I wouldn't trade this experience for the world. It has been wonderful working with a number of entrepreneurs over the last several years, people that are really, really risk takers and adventurous, and it really makes my job so much more enjoyable working with folks in this industry. You talked about regulations, and the regulatory issues are something that every business owner needs to consider. Karen talked about that for a little bit in the sense that, these are things you need to keep up to date with on a regular basis, whether that's a couple times a week, a couple times a month, or even more than a couple times a week. The problem is not so much that the regulations change, although they do change, and those changes present problems like we just discussed with regard to that label, that stamp. But the interpretations of the regs by the agencies change, and that's really what the major issue is. We have a brand new agency here in Colorado called the Marijuana Enforcement Division. It was originally called the Medical Marijuana Enforcement Division. That agency, they try very, very hard to interpret the regulations and do their job. But because it's such a big, robust industry and there's so many players, there's many players at the Med. And what does that mean? That means that many people have different interpretations of the regulations. And regulations, as Karen mentioned, and as she'll tell you more directly in Oakland in June, the fact of the matter is the regs can be read many, many different ways. But what's the only way that matters? It's the way that the Med says it matters, right? So at the end of the day, you really need to stay on top of what that means. Now, this presentation and ultimately this workshop will not focus primarily on Colorado law. We'll use it as a test case, for example, for how things have evolved. Because as in my role at the University of Denver, I've been advising a number of governments both around the states and around the world in drafting the regulations. What they do is they look at Colorado as a model. And that model is not perfect, but it really does show that regulation does work. And if you look at some of the studies that are out there, and there's actually a paper that I've written that will come out in the University of Kentucky Law Journal at the end of this month that will talk about how Colorado's regulatory experiment is a resounding success. But when you talk about regulations, what are you talking about? You're talking about pesticides. You're talking about labeling, the type of nutrients or fertilizers one might use. What are the procedures you have in place for checking in a patient? What are the procedures you have, a patient or a customer for that matter? What are the procedures you have just operationally in your store, your dispensary, your warehouse, your kitchen? Think about employees. What happens if an investigatory process begins? These are all things that Karen certainly experienced, JV's seen a lot of, and we have a unique perspective because we work with so many different people and have seen so many people come and go in the industry that when you look from the inside out, you can really have a good perspective. This is particularly appropriate as California goes down the road of its state-regulated system. Now, by June, will we have draft regulations in California? Who knows? That remains to be seen. But at the end of the day, the process of how things have evolved in California, or will evolve in California, how they did evolve in Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Arizona, many of these states, things have evolved very, very closely. I was recently up in Vancouver City, Canada, advising some of the dispensary owners up there because there is no regulatory structure in place. There's city councils looking at what that process may look like. So what I did and what we hope to bring to the table during this workshop is if you build your business this way and you generally try to stay within these parameters, you're likely to comply with changes in regulations and forthcoming regulations in a place particularly like California. But regulation is not the end of the story. And we talked about different types of licensure. How do you even get a license? What's that process like? It's very, very difficult, whether you're on the infused/manufacturing side of the business, which is not always about edibles. In this day and age,
concentrates, yeah, huge. We make concentrates and tinctures, topicals, all that falls under that MIP license.
Mm-hmm. And MIP is sort of an acronym for marijuana-infused products, and that's something that we'll talk about in great detail. And whether that's a baked good, a high-quality baked good, which, by the way, you've seen how many companies come and go because their products just weren't worth putting in your mouth, frankly.
We have people buying sandwich cookies, pulling out the filling, infusing a filling, and putting it back in. That's not a baked good.
and some of that still happens to this day. But when you think about manufactured products that involve cannabis, there's a lot of focus on concentrates, on things other than edibles, and that really presents some interesting challenges, which is frankly a lot of the reason why that these regulations tend to change and you need to stay on top of those things. But there's different regulatory standards for cultivation facilities, for dispensaries, or marijuana centers, as they're known out in various states under the law. So regulatory issues are one thing. But we'll also start from the idea that you better have your business structurally organized. You better have things your ducks in a row from the very beginning. I've seen far too many businesses that have operated, and someone, once they become successful, comes out of the woodwork and says, "Hey, remember that time that the tavern down the street? You told me that I was going to have 5% of your company." Well, if there's somebody like that, we better know about that now and document either that does or does not exist, so that when your company's worth $1 million versus $1,000, they can ultimately, you know where you stand. And that's also an interesting component. How do you raise capital? How do you raise capital with a structure like that? You need to make sure your structure is done from the beginning. Tell us a little bit about your experience about the business structural components of this stuff.
Well, it's funny because the way I had enough money to get into this business is I had won a baking contest.
Okay.
So I had this money, and I thought, I mean, I'd always wanted to have a bakery, but I thought, Colorado, I should have a weed bakery. My chances of being successful are much greater. And I started talking to friends. This is what I'm going to do with this money. And, oh, you're so crazy. What are you putting that money into that for? Nobody wanted to have anything to do with that.
Right.
Now that I'm successful, everybody wants to invest. A lot of these people are. So, I don't think I need that now. I mean, I've made it just on my own for, the past, since 2010. But it was hard because I didn't have enough money to do a lot after, the fees, the licensing fees are killer. Finding space from a landlord that's reasonable is hard. We're very limited as to where we can rent. So you need help with all of that. I just started very small.
And your business is very equipment intensive, right?
It is, but my first oven I got at the Salvation Army for $60.
Wow.
That's where I started, with this tiny little oven, and just kind of built the business very, very slowly.
Right.
And a few dispensaries here and there. And then as, the business started to, as we started to get well known, then I could start purchasing new things, and we just moved into that space. And
so one of the things that you learned early on is how to be very resourceful.
You got to be resourceful, exactly. And then, you're also buying, if you don't have a grow, you're buying the cannabis to bake with.
Right.
And that's become very expensive here in Colorado, especially on the recreational side, because of the testing.
Right, right.
So, yeah, there are a lot of challenges, but they can all be dealt with. You just have to have having somebody to guide you through is very nice. And we didn't have it. None of us had any of that. Because there's no history, there was no one to turn to.
Right.
It was just, how do I do this?
How do you do this?
Yeah.
And I think that's really ultimately the purpose of the workshop, is not only to help people who are considering going into the industry, but also existing operators. The team that we've assembled, as I mentioned before, have tremendous experience. And it really is about perhaps trying to bypass some of the mistakes that we made.
Mm-hmm.
Not that you can't circumvent all mistakes, but perhaps we can share with you guys, how to avoid some of them. I will tell you from my own experience in the cannabis sector and ensuring this industry, first and foremost, it's been an absolute privilege to do it. I wouldn't trade a day. I love every day in this industry, despite its challenges. I would say there's probably a few things that I would strongly suggest, and you'll get this further at the workshop, is paying close attention to contracts, alrighty? As Bob will likely validate, contracts are killers. And if you don't understand even the basics of a contract, really sort that out to your lawyer before you sign a contract. I've seen some very dramatic situations happen with folks out there when they've gotten involved in contracts and they've lost quite a bit. The second area right now is product liability and the pending litigation that exists out there with the use of pesticides. From an insurance standpoint, product liability insurance is still available in the market, but on a very, very limited basis. So what that means, if you're an existing company or contemplating this, is that self-insurance becomes important. And when I say self-insurance, that means managing your risks internally, all right, so that you have a position should something go wrong. So some of that's going to be having really good manufacturing standards, vetting suppliers, the testing components, all righty, making sure that all of your operating procedures are in place, because you'll need a position should something go wrong, all righty. So that's really the second issue. And then the third area that I've seen over the years is really just employee liability, or employer liability, I should say. And what that falls into is when you're growing a company and you're growing it rapidly, typically you're hiring a lot of people. And what's important that you have an HR person to manage those folks that come in. You've got an employee handbook, because we've seen situations where liability has arisen through perhaps, let's say, discrimination or hiring practices. And by the way, this is not unique to the cannabis industry. It's like any other industry, but it's just something that folks out there need to pay attention to, because from an insurance side, not all of this coverage is available to us, unfortunately. Alrighty, we, in my side, and as an industry, we need more time for insurance carriers to feel comfortable with this industry completely, even though the ones who have been involved have made very healthy profits, quite frankly. Alrighty, but they're still evaluating the risk with any emerging markets. Alrighty, so that would be my words of wisdom.
You know, JB, I would just jump in and just go back to the point you can talk about contracts, right?
Yes, yes.
In a perfect world, we could shake hands,
right,
go on our way, and do a business, and everything would work out just fine.
Correct.
I personally would love to live in that world. I think we all live in that world in our personal lives with our families and with people we know and trust. But unfortunately, people do not necessarily plan to screw one another, so to speak. But what happens to people financially when they get into a bind can ruin your business. So it's in everyone's interest to make sure you sit down at the beginning and put a contract together. That really is a fundamental starting point in this industry. You may not like the idea. It may seem too formal. It's certainly not traditional in the cannabis industry as it's existed for decades.
That's right.
And decades.
Right.
But it is essential because at the end of the day, you need to protect your investment. You're doing this for the challenge. You're doing this to work in a new and exciting industry. You're doing something that you're passionate about, but you can't just go in blindly. You really do have to protect yourself. And starting with the idea and the understanding, just accept it, that you need to document the things that you do and the relationships you have, just so everybody knows where they stand. So I just want to make sure that that comes through, because at the end of the day, I wish that weren't the case. Honest to God, I do. And it's the world we live in, and the fact that people's lives change, and when people get into a predicament, sometimes they do things that will adversely affect you. You'd rather protect yourself.
Absolutely. I think that's a great suggestion. So, and in fact, I know one of the things that I'm interested in doing at the workshop is actually having a breakout session to help a lot of the participants with just, number one, understanding the basics of a contract and what that entails. And let me tell you, before I was in this industry, I didn't even understand the basics of a contract. But once I did, it allowed me to feel knowledgeable and even empowered in a certain way so that I can more properly function and operate within my own company. Alrighty. So that being said, I'd like to thank Bob and Karen for being with us today. On the behalf of our team that we've assembled, I know we're all excited to be out there in Oakland on June 20th. We're very thankful to the National Cannabis Industry Association and the Cannabis Business Summit for allowing us the opportunity to provide you guys with this valuable information. So if you decide to register, just simply go to the cannabisbusinesssummit.com. And if you look at day one under workshops, under Monday, June 20th, 2016, you can see right here we're offering a full day workshop, and all of us will be there, and we're looking for a great event.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, can't wait.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.